Thank you, everyone, for coming to this virtual event hosted by the Kellogg Institute for International Studies. I'm Vania Smith-Oka from the Department of Anthropology and a fellow at Kellogg. I'm happy to be your host today. I'm glad to see so many people here who are interested in hearing Dr. Beatriz-Reyes-Foster talk about madness, modernity, and coloniality in Mexico. So this event is part of the Kellogg Institute lecture series. So the Kellogg Institute is an active community of scholars composed of faculty, staff, and students who are both undergraduate and graduate students. And this week, Kellogg is joining the broader university in celebrating Graduate Appreciation Week, which is an important way for us to remind ourselves to acknowledge our graduate students and all they do for our community. So they host and engage in events, they work as teaching and research assistants, and they're also being trained to be the next generation of scholars. So to introduce our speaker, Dr. Beatriz Reyes-Foster is an associate professor as well as the graduate coordinator in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Central Florida. Her research focuses on medical anthropology, specifically on the cultural interactions between medical systems and those who use them. She holds a BA from Rutgers University and both her MA and PhD in sociocultural anthropology from the University of California at Berkeley. She has written about identity, media representations of indigenous people, personhood and self, cultural constructions of health and illness, and the connections between religion, spiritual beliefs, and biomedicine. Her work has focused on suicide prevention in Yucatan in Mexico, and more recently on the encounters and disconnects between Yucatec Maya patients and psychiatrists in an acute ward of a public psychiatry hospital from which emerged her first book, Psychiatric Encounters, Madness and Modernity in Yucatan, Mexico, which was published in 2018 by Rutgers University Press. Her most recent book, Sharing Milk, Intimacy, Materiality, and Biocommunities of Practice, is co-authored with Shannon Carter and just came out last week. Her talk today is entitled Psychiatric Encounters in the Colonial Matrix of Power, Persistent Colonialism in a Mexican Psychiatric Institution. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Reyes-Foster.
Well, thank you so much. I am very excited to be here. I am going to initiate screen sharing since I have a presentation ready. And I just want to, oh, hold on just a moment. There we go. And I just want to thank you, Vania, for that introduction and for and to thank you and the Kellogg Institute and the University of Notre Dame for the invitation. I am really thrilled to be here with you today. So today's talk is based on my book, Psychiatric Encounters, Madness and Modernity in Yucatan, Mexico. And I really, I did my best to try to fit in as much as I could within the time allotted, but I do encourage all of you, if you want to read some of these ideas in more depth, I do encourage you to pick up the book and give it a read. And I want to begin today's talk with three distinctive points of departure to which we will return at different points throughout the presentation. The first is a public post that will appear on our website, and it was written by someone that just went by the name JR in October 2012. And it was a post that was directed at Dr. Juan Vasquez, who had been the director of Las Lomas, the psychiatric hospital where this research was based, from the 1970s through the 1990s, so for a period of 20 years. And this note was directed towards him, even though he was no longer the director of the hospital. And the note says, Las Lomas is a prison, a medieval dungeon where people are locked away without the possibility of appeal, denied their liberty following an initial assessment made without seriousness by a recent graduate or student. I would sooner lock my relative in a room than I would allow them to spend 1 second in your quote-unquote hospital. The second point is something that Dr. Vasquez actually said to me during a conversation about the inauguration of the psychiatric hospital in the 70s. They put us next to the city dump. Of course we got the message. And finally, the words of Don Gustavo, who was a patient who I got to know in 2012. I eat just fine, What I don't like is having people talk about me without asking me things directly. And so what is Las Lomas? Las Lomas is a psychiatric facility in Merida. It is the only psychiatric hospital in the Yucatan Peninsula, and it serves a large population. The average length of stay is 3 weeks. It has a psychiatric emergency room, an intensive care ward, a long-term care ward, and it also offers outpatient pediatric services, outpatient services to adults, and serves approximately 69,000 patients a year. And among the services that it offers are both psychotherapy as well as psychiatric medication management. Needless to say, it is a hospital that has, where the needs have long outgrown the physical capabilities of the institution. The research upon which this presentation and book are based involves ethnographic engagement in the Yucatan since 2003. I'm also from Yucatan originally, and have been actively engaged in the region as a researcher for almost 20 years. It specifically involved 12 months of research on mental health inside and outside of the psychiatric facility, conducted over 2008, 2012, and 2013. And it involved observing hundreds of medical encounters, taking hundreds of pages of handwritten notes, 97 electronic field notes, and conducting 60 interviews with patients, family members, psychologists, psychiatrists, and hospital volunteers. All of this data makes up the foundation of this research. So to return to JR's letter, JR refers to Las Lomas as a medieval dungeon. And one can certainly understand his position. One of the things that I have started to work on since my research in Mexico has actually been to serve as an expert witness in immigration proceedings against severely mentally ill Mexican citizens, because the international observers have concluded that the conditions in Mexico's psychiatric facilities are so bad that they are tantamount to torture. And many of the cases that I have served on have been successful because of the conditions of these facilities. And so what this looks like in practice, we're talking about a 160-bed facility, and as you saw, with 69,000 people using its services, it certainly does not have the capacity to provide services to that many people. These are not all inpatient, of course. However, it does give you a sense of the size of the hospital and its capacity as opposed to the demand for services. And people who are unfortunate enough to need hospitalization go through a really difficult experience. They have every aspect of their life controlled, including what to wear, what to eat. In the acute ward, patients are locked down for 22 hours a day. They're allowed no personal effects, no reading materials, nothing. And the hospital is a site of multiple human rights violations. Some of the things that I witnessed were treatment without consent, overuse of pharmaceuticals, long-term use of physical and chemical restraints, isolation, and electroconvulsive therapy used as punishment or for behavior modifications. So there is certainly some merit when JR calls Las Lomas a medieval dungeon. However, at the same time that we can see that there are really difficult and terrible things that are happening, truly atrocious things that are happening. What we see are people that are not necessarily evil, right? The doctors and the nurses and the social workers and the psychologists that work within these walls are not necessarily evil per se, but rather are trying to comply with the mandates of an institution and a social structure. And a governmental system. I read a quote that said something along the lines of people trying to be human in the most inhumane conditions, and I found that to be the case not only of the patients in the hospital, but very often of the practitioners inside it as well. And so why? What are the conditions that lead to the creation of conditions such as the ones that I've just described? A big part of it has to do with the kinds of priorities that the Mexican government places on mental health in general. To begin with, Mexico spends very little of its GDP on healthcare, only about 5%. And of this budget, it only spends 2% of its overall health budget on mental health care services, 80% of which goes to psychiatric hospitals, right? So there's very little outpatient mental health care available within communities themselves. There are approximately 0.67 psychiatrists per 100,000 people practicing in Mexico today. And we can contrast that to the US, which also has a shortage of psychiatrists. And in the United States, we have 12 psychiatrists per 100,000 people. And so many people have argued that what we are seeing in Mexico is the form of social abandonment of people with mental illness in Mexican society, a lack of prioritization of mental health care. So this is summarized nicely when Juan Vazquez recalls the moment when the hospital, when Las Lomas itself was inaugurated back in 1970. At the time, the hospital was state of the art. It was considered to be a great leap forward. However, Juan remembers because he was there, and he said to me, "Well, they put us next to the city dump, so we got the message." There's an understanding that has been expressed to me by multiple people of a sense of psychiatric patients not mattering, of a social abandonment. So when we think about mental illness and severe mental illness specifically, one of the tools that I find really useful for thinking through psychiatric outcomes in different places is Byron Good's hypotheses to understanding schizophrenia outcomes in different places. So Byron Good is a psychiatrist and anthropologist, and he came up with these hypotheses as a way of trying to understand why the outcomes of schizophrenia in so-called developing nations or the global south appeared to be better over time than those of people with schizophrenia living in developed nations or the global north. And so Good concludes that in order to really understand the outcome of schizophrenia, one needs to understand first the local interpretation of mental illness. How is mental illness conceived and prioritized on the ground by society and by individuals within society? Second, the presence of a strong family support network, ensuring that people that are struggling with severe mental illness, such as schizophrenia, are still have the social support of their family and are still treated as full members of the family. Third, having available and forms and valuing of labor. And by this does not necessarily mean remunerated labor, but rather that people with severe mental illness still are able to contribute to the family economy in some way, even if it's by providing unremunerated support in the form of cooking, of caring for children, of working if on land, if the family is if it's an agricultural society. In other words, that the person still is able to contribute in some way to the family, and that they're still valued as a contributor to the family. And then finally, the basic social environment in which the person is. In other words, the political economy, if questions such as poverty, availability of healthcare, and so on. And so when we look at Mexico, we talk about the global north and global south, but Mexico is a place that doesn't really fit in with either one. I tend to think of Mexico as sort of the global middle. And I say this because Mexico has the second largest economy in Latin America. It has a large indigenous population with very, very large wealth disparities. Some of the wealthiest people in the world are Mexicans, and yet we see tremendous poverty. And we also see kind of particular ways of interpreting illness that matched, this sort of middle ground, where in some places we see kind of a broader local acceptance of people with severe mental illness, and then in other places we see more of the social abandonment and disengagement. And so the last thing that I would like to point out about Mexico specifically, and this is something that I observed through my interactions with participants, through my reading of public discourse, and my interviews, is a preoccupation with the idea of modernity. Over and over, I saw in many different discourses the idea that Mexico is not modern, and that Mexico is trying to strive towards modernity as sort of this end stage in a journey. And I found that very striking, because Mexico already is modern. It's just that its modernity maybe is imperfect, one might argue. So I tie this to the idea of coloniality. Franz Fanon was a Martinican psychiatrist who traveled to France and eventually Algeria, and he developed some of the most important post-colonial theory, really, of the 20th century. And Fanon, as a psychiatrist, writes in The Wretched of the Earth that the experience of living under colonialism has such severe psychological effect that it in fact actually drives mental illness, that it causes a mental illness through the very mechanisms of oppression that we can observe in the colonial relationships. And I found this to be really interesting in thinking of Mexico as an inherently post-colonial society, or even as an inherently still colonial society. And so when I say that, obviously Mexico has been independent for 200 years. And so when I say that Mexico remains a colonial society, what I mean by that is that there is still a continuation of colonial relationships that have continued beyond colonization. And these have to do with assumptions that drive the economic system, with the ways in which authority is maintained and reiterated, with the kinds of knowledge that are valued on the ground, with local understandings of gender and sexuality. All of these things are tied to the continuing relationships that start with colonialism. And so this was actually already been discussed by a Mexican sociologist named Pedro González Casanova back in the 1980s, where he talks about internal colonialism and the way in which the Mexican society continues to treat much of its own people as colonial subjects. And so when we talk about this continuation of colonial relationships well beyond the end of colonialism, we can talk about the constitution of the colonial matrix of power. And I'll talk more about this as we move on. So to clarify then, colonialism refers to a system of governance. Coloniality refers to the processes and relationships that continue and that maintain colonial relationships. And Walter Mignolo, who is one of the most well-known thinkers of coloniality of power and of postcolonial studies, talks about how coloniality and modernity are essentially two sides of the same coin. That the reason that we see many of the problems that we see in the global South and in post-colonial nations is precisely because modernity cannot exist without coloniality. And within this idea of Western modernity, then, is our current capitalist system. We see a very similar argument coming out of critical race theory as well, where we see that, where the argument is that capitalism is intimately tied to chattel slavery, and modern capitalism would be impossible without it. And all of this is part of colonialism and the legacy of colonialism. So coloniality is not over, it is all over, as Walter Mignolo argues. And part of this is this distinction that Fanon originally draws between the colonizer and the colonized, where the colonizer is understood to exist in what is called a zone of being, a zone of existing, and the colonized is seen as existing within a zone of non-being. And there's an impermeable line in between the two, the colonizer and the colonized. And this is where I push back, because I find that the line between colonizer and colonized is actually quite permeable. And I'll be returning to this concept later on in the presentation. So just something to kind of keep in mind for now. So when we talk about the colonial matrix of power, then we can understand the colonial matrix of power as being constituted by political economy, structural violence, individual agency, and intersubjective experiences. When we talk about political economy, of course, I'm talking about the political and economic context of contemporary Mexico. And one of the things that has been a very, one of the most important challenges for contemporary Mexico, of course, is the problem of corruption. Corruption fills pages and pages and pages of newspaper editorials and is discussed broadly as being one of the biggest barriers to really for Mexico to achieve stability and prosperity. So public intellectual Carlos Myers Serra, who writes in response to a comment made by then President Enrique Peña Nieto. Peña Nieto had publicly said that Mexico had a problem of a culture of corruption. And Myers Serra took real issue with that statement. And he wrote in a newspaper editorial, if we accept that corruption is cultural, we would have to accept that the modernization of our country is not possible in the short term. Things are how they are because we are how we are. And it is certainly that, again, it's this preoccupation that we cannot be modern if we are corrupt. Mexico's current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, of course, was elected on a platform of eliminating corruption. And unfortunately, it does not seem that he has been able to eradicate it as promised either. And so the question then becomes, okay, well, what is it about corruption that drives it? And for me, it comes down to small everyday events. And so the example that I'm drawn to is the situation that I encountered with Don Gustavo, who's the patient I mentioned at the outset of this presentation. Don Gustavo was an elderly man. He was suffering from dementia. And I met him when his family, his wife and daughters, brought him to Las Lomas to the emergency room seeking help. They came, they brought the medications with them. They showed it to the attending physician, whose name was Dr. Patron. And Dr. Patron looked at the medication, and he stated that this medication was really not what he needed for his condition. And so we found out that Don Gustavo was actually a beneficiary of IMSS, or the Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social. So to give you a very, very quick primer on Mexican insurance, which can be very confusing, the Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social is the social insurance agency for anyone who is a beneficiary through their employer, and it provides full coverage health insurance. Beneficiaries are supposed to be able to access all of the health care they need and the medication they need free of cost. And El Seguro also provides other kinds of benefits, such as pension benefits, housing loans. It's a huge organization. But one of the problems that this organization has been, among many, is medication shortages. And so even though this family was actually quite fortunate to be beneficiaries of EAMS, they weren't able to access the medication that Don Gustavo needed because the medication was simply on back order, was not available. And so during this consultation, Dr. Patron was the attending psychiatrist. He was also accompanied by a senior resident named Ana, or who I call Ana. And Ana, in the middle of the conversation, proposed, well, why don't you enroll Don Gustavo in Seguro Popular? Seguro Popular at the time, it's now changed names, was the free insurance that is available for people who are not beneficiaries of the other national health insurance schemes, be they EAMS or a couple of others that are available for state employees and for military. And so Seguro Popular was a health insurance that was available very cheap or free of charge for people who did not have other insurance. And at the time, you could enroll in it, really with no questions asked, as long as you had certain identity documentation. And at the time, Seguro Popular did not have the same kind of stock out problems with certain medications as EAMS. However, it was illegal, and it still is illegal, to enroll in the public Seguro Popular insurance scheme if one already was a beneficiary of another one. It was a form of doubling up on insurance. And this actually sparked a big conversation between Dr. Patron and Ana. And it was a big disagreement because Dr. Patron felt that it was unethical to suggest to the patient that they break the law by enrolling in Seguro Popular, and it could also potentially strain Seguro Popular's resources, that this was a way of undermining the free insurance scheme. And Ana's argument essentially was that if the state had already broken its end of the social contract by providing an insurance scheme that did not actually provide the needed care, that Don Gustavo and his family had the prerogative to do whatever they needed to do to ensure that he had access to the medication that he needed. And she finally just concluded this with, everyone does it. And so for me, this was a really good example of the daily operationalization of what one could consider to be corrupt behavior, where we're not talking about, bribing a police officer because he pulls you over, or a lawmaker receiving a bribe to pass a law, or stealing public funds, but really just small abuses of the system because the system has already been broken. We also should think about the role of structural violence in shaping the contemporary conditions of the psychiatric facility. Structural violence refers to the ways in which social structure itself allows for certain abuses to take place on people's bodies and on people's minds. And so to return to Don Gustavo then, Don Gustavo, when he first came in, was asked a series of questions. He was asked his name. He was asked what day of the week it was, what year it was, what month, whether it was daytime or nighttime. And what happened was that Don Gustavo quickly became unable to answer the questions. He wasn't able to say what day of the week it was. When he was asked what year it was, he said it was 1990. When he was asked what month it was, he said he didn't remember. And so the reason that mental health practitioners ask these questions is to see whether or not a patient is properly oriented in person, time, and place. And if a patient is not properly oriented, then they are no longer considered to be reliable historians of themselves. They lose their ability to be able to speak for themselves. And so as soon as the resident Ana realized that Don Gustavo was not properly oriented, she shifted her questioning entirely to his wife. And this is when Don Gustavo spoke up, because Ana asked a series of questions about his behavior, and she asked about his eating habits. And as his wife was responding, and her answer was that he's not eating, he said, "I eat just fine. What I don't like is having people talk about me without asking me directly." And this demonstrates a kind of a very, an acuity and understanding of his own position, and of realizing that his voice is no longer being heard. And it is a form of structural violence. At the same time, people have individual agency within this matrix, within this formation. Nicholas Rose writes that truth is not only the outcome of construction, but of contestation. Truth is always enthroned by acts of violence. And I recall this writing because of an interaction that happened between a woman named Manuela and her doctor in the acute ward. Manuela had been found wandering the streets of a city over 4 hours away by car called Chetumal. She had been talking to herself, and she drew the attention of the authorities. She was picked up and taken by the authorities to Las Lomas, 4 hours away. And she remained there for a number of weeks. For a good portion of that time, she was in isolation, essentially until she responded to treatment. She responded to the medication. So she came in a really, really deeply psychotic state, really not able to answer any questions. She came in actually as a Jane Doe because no one knew who she was. And eventually she was able to come out of the psychotic state and was able to finally provide information about her identity. This interaction happened towards the end of her stay, after Manuela was much better, but still was saying things that suggested she wasn't completely well. She was saying that she spoke 7 languages, that she had 5 different college degrees, that she worked for Interpol, that she was a Canadian citizen, and all of these claims together led Dr. Pacheco to conclude that she was still suffering from delusions. And so this day marked a turning point for Manuela's case. Dr. Pacheco asked her, "Manuela, are you bothered by the fact that sometimes that I might doubt some of the things you tell me? I feel that not everything you tell me is true. There are many things that are true, but there are others that are not. Do you mind that sometimes I don't believe everything you tell me?" To which Manuela responded, "Do you think I'm a liar?" And Dr. Pacheco said, "No, well, it's not that you're a liar." And Manuela interrupted and said, "I understand. When I tell you things about myself, you don't believe it all, just about half." And Pacheco answered, "More or less half, exactly. I believe part of it. But when you tell me you studied 5 degrees, it seems difficult. I mean, impossible, but okay, let me just keep one. I studied." And at this point, Pacheco was delighted. He laughed, he smiled, and he told her, "Yes, I like that. That's right." And Manuela said, "I studied to be a handcraft teacher." And he responded, "Okay, that's more like it. It's more believable." And the reason this was a turning point was not necessarily because Manuela had stopped believing the things about herself that she was saying, but that she had come to understand that she needed to negotiate her truth, and that in order to be seen to be making progress, in order that she understood what was expected of her. And so Manuela's internal state was not important as her ability to recognize that the things that she was saying weren't believed and that she could modify the things that she was saying. And so for me, this is a negotiation of truth where, what the patient actually believes is not nearly as important as her recognition that she needs to say the right thing in order to be seen to be making progress. Within the psychiatric hospital, all of the patients have different experiences. For many of them, the stay is extremely difficult. However, Lena was a woman in her early 20s, and when I met her, she had been hospitalized at Las Lomas every year for a number of years. And Lena was actually a trained psychologist. And so when she was admitted, Dr. Toon, who was one of the physicians that I worked most closely with, was actually visibly upset because she was the attending psychiatrist for women and she had to attend to Lena. And she explained to me that she really didn't want to treat Lena because she knew that Lena was faking her symptoms, that Lena knew how to manipulate psychological discourses and symptoms in order to get herself committed. And so Dr. Toon said, Lena is a sane woman who wants to be treated as if she were insane. She wants to be restrained. She wants to be isolated. She wants this. And she has a certain logic to her actions, even though it's not a logic that we understand, and certainly not a logic that we appreciate. And so she almost immediately had Lena moved from the acute care ward to the long-term ward. And when Lena found this out, she became very upset and said, "The doctor there only sees you once a day." She cried. Here, they see you 3 times a day. And so even though one might not necessarily understand Lena's motivations, we can see that the subjective experience of psychiatric hospitalization varies widely. And so all of these things, these different kind of ways of understanding the functioning and experiences of the psychiatric hospital can be thought through using the concept of zones of being that I brought up earlier in this presentation. Fanon's notion is essentially that within colonized societies, there is this irreconcilable difference between the zone of being and the zone of non-being, as being the line between the colonizer and the colonized. One could further stretch this idea to think about the colonizer and the colonized through the lens of sanity, the colonizer, the zone of being the zone of sanity, and the zone of non-being being a zone of insanity. But these are social constructs. And when we think about this, one asks, well, is the line between colonizer and colonized truly irreconcilable? Can there be shades of gray? And how do we explore these kinds of border areas, such as the border between madness and sanity? And so in thinking about these ideas, I started thinking about the notion of the verb to be as we think of it in Spanish, right? So traditionally, when Fanon has been translated to Spanish, we talk about the zona de ser and the zona de no ser, the zone of being and the zone of non-being. But in Spanish, we have a second form of the verb to be, which is the verb estar. Estar is a temporary being. It's not a permanent being. It's more of a state of mind or a state of being. And so if we kind of stretch this concept of thinking about zones of being and non-being towards zona del estar as a zone of temporary being, then we can think about how this conceptual framework might be applied in thinking through the colonial relationships within various social phenomena. And here I'm thinking about the psychiatric hospital. And so the zona del estar then becomes an area of flux and change within the colonial matrix of power, characterized by a temporality of constant presence. And so it is an area that can be entered and exited, that one can be placed into, and where there is room for agency, but there is also a firm political, economic, and power context. And so when we think about how we operationalize this concept, then we can think about within Zona del Estar as areas of negotiation, of clamoring for voice, of finding one's place, all always within the confines of and limits of the socioeconomic context. And so this leaves a series of open questions that can be explored at a later time, that could be kind of thought with, that can be applied to other contexts. And one is the role of individual agency versus social structure, which is sort of an ever-present question that we as anthropologists think about in many different ways. Another question is, what are other instances where this conceptual framework could productively be applied? And then finally, well, once we've done this, what do we do with it? What happens now? What is the purpose? And I think that may be the most difficult question of all. As I said, it was quite difficult to fit all of this into a 35-minute conversation. So with that, I thank you, and I am eager to hear questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reyes-Foster. I really appreciate all these great things that you've given us to think with. Let's see, I've asked people to post questions, but they haven't. So since we seem to be a relatively small group, maybe instead of people posting questions in the chat, we could just, I could just call on people if you want to unmute yourselves, maybe also unmute your video so Dr. Reyes-Foster can interact with us a little bit more organically, or raise your hands. So I invite all of you to, well, any of you really, to ask questions. Jessie, graduate student in anthropology, so you'll get some good anthro question here.
Hi, thank you for talking to us. I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about these three zones that you've talked about in this framework of ser, no ser, and the zona del estar. Where else do you see these kind of being able to be productively applied as far as thinking about different things?
So I found that there's anything that involves kind of thinking with border thinking, places where there's a lot of shades of gray, and I'm actually kind of curious to see if it is a useful framework for others. One of the initial ways in which I actually started thinking about zones of being and non-being was actually in thinking of U.S. academia, and I actually published an article in Anthropological Quarterly about kind of the ways in which certain voices are within scholarship are privileged over others, and kind of thinking of the way in which indigenous thought is very often kind of zoned into non-being, simply by kind of thinking about the notion of ontologies. And so here I was responding to criticism by indigenous scholars towards Latour's work, and Latour talking about kind of the ontologies, ontological thinking, and about the agency of objects, and as though this were a novel idea. And then we have Zoe Todd and Kim Talbert kind of being like, wait, hold up, this is not a novel idea. This is an idea that is part of indigenous ontology, but because it's thought of as an indigenous ontology, it doesn't merit the same kind of merit as something that's considered a scholarship that's founded, for instance, in the work of a continental philosopher like Deleuze. So that is one of the instances in which I have kind of thought about how these zones can be used to think with in other places.
Go ahead, Tracy. Are you about to ask a question?
I did have a question, but
yeah, go ahead, Tracy.
Okay.
Postdoc and future assistant professor in anthropology.
Oh, that's great.
Thank you for this talk. This is super interesting, and it's interesting for me because of the work that I'm doing now, but what I'm trying to move into, and so it's given me a lot to think about. I am wondering if you could talk more. It's there, and it wasn't as prominent in what you've presented, so hopefully it's in the book too. But if you could talk more about the different forms of care that you saw come up in these contexts, because it definitely exists. It's clear that it exists, and this is the idea that I'm trying to work through in my own stuff too. So if you could just speak a little bit more about like the ways that care comes up, who's providing the care, what care work looks like in these contexts, and how it's received maybe. But just like around this idea of care.
Yes. So in terms of what care work looks like in these spaces, one of the things that I find really interesting is sort of the way in which, even though this is an extremely oppressive space, particularly within the acute ward, there's a lot of room for care work from family. There were family members who come into the institution on a daily basis to check on their loved one, to bring them food, to inquire for their health. There was one really poignant example of a young man who had been hospitalized for a suicide attempt, and his mother was an indigenous woman. They had traveled from a village, and she told him that she was sleeping in the hospital vestibule every night. And she wasn't actually doing this, but she told him this because she wanted him to think of her as being like just outside the gate, as being there. And family support plays a tremendous role in outcomes, really, because when there is a family member that is there, the treatments that the patient receives, the kinds of really troubling behaviors that we can see, like when, for instance, one of the things that I did not get a chance to speak to at length in this presentation is, for instance, the use of ECT for behavior modification. That's less likely to happen if you have a family member that is there meeting regularly with the physicians. In terms of kind of professional care workers, obviously the hospital, most of the care is actually provided by nurses, not by the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist, the attending psychiatrist will see the patient, within the acute setting. In the morning when they first come in, they'll kind of check in on them at their beds, and then they'll have an individual consultation in the afternoon. And then the residents are the ones that will then kind of check on the patient at other times during the day. But really the primary interactions between the patient and caretakers within the institution, of course, is with nurses. There's also social workers and psychologists that provide services as well. But the primary interaction is with the nurses. And one of the things that's really interesting is that then this leads to kind of turf wars and conflict between the nurses and the doctors, where the nurses will take issue with how certain doctors are handling certain cases, and so that is kind of another aspect of it as well.
to piggyback off of Tracy's question, I wonder if there's also aspects of sort of how things like gender or class, race, color, ethnicity,
Oh, yeah.
you know, how any of these like play a role. Like we hear of these patients, but I'm trying to get a sense, like, is there a difference in the way that some patients are treated versus others, or is everyone, you know, sort of like treated the same? So I would love to hear more about the nuance about how the patient's background influences treatment.
Absolutely. So, I mean, obviously, one of the first things I'll say is that if a patient has the financial resources and has family support, they are likely never going to be admitted to Las Lomas. Even if they become very, very ill, they'll be treated either in a facility in another state, or they'll be treated at home. Las Lomas is infamous for being a place that you don't want to wind up in. And so the only instances I saw of people who were upper class or middle class within the facility were very often people who had been abandoned by their families. There was one elderly woman who was sort of left in a wheelchair in the hospital vestibule, and her family couldn't be tracked down. And after talking to her, it became pretty clear that she had a family with resources, and for whatever reason, they did not want to take care of her anymore. But this was rare. I mean, this is not something that was very commonplace. However, of course, when you're dealing with Yucatan, you're going to see intersections between indigeneity and class and certainly gender. Within the facility, one of the things that was really interesting was the fact that we had a large number of patients who were Maya speakers. And we also actually had, a good number of nurses who were Maya speakers, and a couple of doctors too. Nevertheless, all of the treatment took place in Spanish. And this is actually something that when I presented my research in Mexico at the medical school came up as why is it that even though we have this opportunity to provide care in the language of the people, and in fact, Indigenous people are protected by the Indigenous Languages Act. They're supposed to have a right to receive care in their language, and yet the language continues to be Spanish, and that seems to be the convention. And there really doesn't seem to be a particularly good reason other than sort of the idea that, this is what we do. This is the language we use when we do our work. Even if in private we use an Indigenous language. One of the most striking cases for me was actually a gentleman who was in the acute ward. He was one of Dr. Pacheco's patients, and he had an advanced schizophrenia. He was elderly, kind of getting into suffering more like long-term effects of schizophrenia, and also was fairly severely alcoholic. And he had been hospitalized for quite some time. And when you spoke to him, he had all of the kind of the markings of someone who has the psychotic disorder. He spoke in circles. It was really difficult to talk to him. We would get word salad, or he'd start singing in the middle of a conversation. This is fairly common. But one of the things that really struck me was that Dr. Pacheco had been treating him in Spanish the entire time. This was the day he was being released. He was still not well, but he was stable. And Dr. Pacheco started speaking to him in Maya. And my knowledge of Maya is basic, but I had enough I knew enough Maya to realize that the patient was a lot more coherent in Maya than he was in Spanish, a lot more. And after he left, I asked Dr. Pacheco, and I said, was that my imagination, or did he seem more lucid? Was he more organized in Maya? And he told me, no, that wasn't your imagination. He is more organized in Maya. But what he told me was I don't feel like my Maya is good enough for me to treat him in Maya. But it raised this really interesting question about, well, how sick really was he, and what would his treatment have looked like if he had been provided with treatment in his language.
That's really fascinating. How the mind might be organized very differently based on language.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, what happens in the brain in the bilingual brain when it comes to serious mental illness. I mean, it hasn't been sufficiently explored. There's a lot we don't know there.
Yeah. We have a couple of questions in the chat. There's one by Sherry Jankowski. She writes, how much stigma is associated with a psychiatric hospital in the Yucatan as, say, compared with the US or other places? Do you get a sense of alternative treatment options, etc.? Are people seeking care elsewhere and maybe just seeking care at the psychiatric hospital as a last resort?
Definitely a last resort. It is highly stigmatized. People generally don't like to share that they've been hospitalized, and even within people who are hospitalized in the area hospitals, doctors will actually try really hard not to refer people to the psychiatric hospital if they can help it. This question of alternative care is really interesting. There's actually there's a number of people who will indigenous people will go to the Xmen first. So the Xmen is the local kind of indigenous healer, and it's a religious as well as medical role. They tend to do things like exorcisms, but they will also practice plant-based medicine. And there's actually 2 or 3 famous ones in the village of Sucacab that run and I never got to visit it, but I know this from my colleague Miguel Güemes, who's a medical anthropologist from Yucatan and who is Maya himself, that essentially run a traditional medicine clinic out of their homes in Sucacab. And so people will arrive, and very often what they're seeking is care related to mental health and mental illness. And so what we see at Las Lomas is really the people who have attempted all of the other methods, who have essentially exhausted all of their options, and who are very sick. For the most part, that's who winds up committed, especially, and Vania, you were asking about gender. Women are much more likely to be committed than men. And when they're committed, they're likely to not be as severely symptomatic. So the men that I interacted with, they tended to have extremely severe psychotic symptoms. Some were nonverbal. They were very, very unwell. Whereas the women, many of them were there for suicide attempt or anorexia or eating disorder. And there were severely mentally ill women as well. There were women who were experiencing psychotic symptoms, but you saw a lot more variety in terms of the severities of symptoms and in terms of the kinds of diagnoses that they came in with. And it tended to be more urban women that wound up committed, not nearly as many women from outside of the city. Whereas the men tended to be more from rural communities.
That's a really interesting demographic spread. I'm sure there's all sorts of reasons behind that. There is another question from someone else in the audience, from Mauricio Bahari. He says, great talk. Is there a movement within the psychiatric or medical profession towards a more just / decolonized provision of psychiatric care and treatment?
I have not heard the term decolonized. I think that would be amazing. There is a move towards something called the Modelo Hidalgo, which is a model that is that's more humanized, that's heavily influenced by anti-psychiatric thinking. So it's very much against forced medication and treatment without consent. And The model has been implemented in 7 different facilities in Mexico. The main problem is that there's very little commitment from the federal government to fully follow through. And so what they'll do is they'll start making these reforms and then they fizzle out for various reasons. So in Yucatan, we actually had a federal takeover of Las Lomas that happened after I had done my research there. And they actually were trying to implement the Hidalgo model, and they did for some time. But you know, the role of politics, it's not something that I talked about enough during this talk, but everything changes according to the political whims of the ruling party. So Modelo Hidalgo was something that was somewhat embraced during the prior pre-administration. When AMLO came in, it was, you know, as far as I can tell, it's been completely abandoned. So at the psychiatric hospital where I did my research at Las Lomas, they had implemented Modelo Hidalgo, or were trying to, cause a huge unrest among the staff, a lot of discomfort among the staff. And the precedent was inaugurated, I guess, in December, Vania, or January. It was sometime and literally days after the inauguration, a group of police came and forcibly removed the hospital administrators, removed the director, the assistant director, basically anyone that had any power, and then they reverted right back to what had been in place prior, and really for no good reason other than, you know, the election. And you see this kind of over and over with the you know, with any kind of power position, it's really about the whims of the ruling party and their priorities. And I suppose in the US it's very similar. I don't know if you'd have the police come and forcibly remove hospital administrators, but you do see kind of how priorities really depend on political whim.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, and I've seen that in my own work in Mexico too. But that's a really violent way of changing. You know, especially
even for Mexico, that was really extreme. I was quite shocked. I wouldn't have believed it if Dr. Vázquez hadn't actually sent me the videos.
And the effect on the mental health already of patients who are already maybe traumatized from different life events, and then you have something like this where the people who've been looking after them are, you know, taken out in a violent fashion is really, must be re-traumatizing for many of them.
I completely agree. I was very concerned about the well-being of the patients at the time.
Kayla, do you have a question? You unmuted your video. I wasn't sure if you wanted to ask something.
Yeah. Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it, as well as I read your book a couple years back. So it was a nice refresher as well to hear you speak about it again. But I was curious if you could speak about the training of the physicians, and because there's the tying of the stigma towards being in the psychiatric units, like, was there stigma towards the training of the profession of becoming a psychiatrist?
So psychiatrist is the lowest paid medical specialty in Mexico, and so there's already stigma there. There's all kinds of like terms that are used for psychiatrists that are derogatory, like loquero is a good one. So psychiatrists themselves feel that they are stigmatized for pursuing this particular specialty. There's a lot of discourses of science that psychiatrists are not scientific enough, so there's always this sort of conflict between the psychoanalytically trained psychiatrists, who are really the old guard and disappearing, or, you know, I don't think there's any like recent psychiatry specialist that has a psychoanalytic background. And this is Freudian psychoanalysis. It's not Freudian, which is really interesting. That Erich Fromm is really the most influential of the psychoanalysts in Mexico. But versus the biomedical psychiatrists, which are, you know, heavily influenced by, like, you know, neuropsychiatry, and tend to lean more heavily on psychiatric medications. One of the points of concern with Las Lomas, for instance, was that this is a teaching hospital, right? So the psychiatry residents that are trained at Las Lomas are learning how to do their work within this institution. And what they'll do is they'll have like the first year, they have a group of first year students, and then they have a group of fifth year students. And so they start out there, and then they get moved to other psychiatric hospitals, and then they come back to finish up. The other subspecialty that I saw there was the integrative medicine residents also do a rotation inside the psychiatric hospital. And they I don't think deal with the same kind of stigma as the psychiatry residents do.
Interesting. Thank you so much.
Do we have other questions from the audience? Go ahead, Jessie.
Yeah, just going off of what you just said about how the integrative physicians train in Las Lomas as well. Could you speak a little more about what their role is kind of structurally as far as like dealing with mental illness or just
integrative medicine is a relatively new specialization in Mexico. These doctors are, I think to a certain extent, they're trying to bridge the shortage gap because there's such few psychiatrists available. So they receive sort of extra training so that they can provide like psychiatric medications and diagnosis. They also are kind of receive more like specialized training in other areas of medicine, and so they're kind of envisioned as being able to treat the whole person, which is where the whole notion of integrative medicine comes from. And so I think that in many respects they're kind of envisioned to be kind of working in some of the places that have had historically low access to physicians.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit about, your experiences as a researcher in these spaces. The stories you shared are very troubling, and yet they're probably some of the milder ones you've witnessed. Mm-hmm. Like if you could just do it for those of us who don't work in these particular spaces. I mean, what is it like as a researcher? How do you navigate this, not only physically, like through these spaces, but then what effect does this have on your own mental health and well-being? Like, how do you cope as a scholar in such troubling times?
Well, it took me a long time to publish the book. And for a long time, I was convinced that it was never going to be published because writing it was extremely difficult. How does it, what's the experience? It's really depressing. That it's the reason why my second project is on human milk sharing, because I was, when I finished my research in 2013, I was so ready to put this project behind me that I wanted to embrace something that was going to be completely different. And boy, was it completely different, right? I'm glad I did. I think that I needed that break, and I needed that different engagement in order to be able to eventually return to the book to actually write it and finish it. At the time, it was really difficult, especially 2012 was really, I conducted research at the hospital in 2008, where I was there for 6 months and I was going every day, but my research was not inside the acute ward. And so in 2012, I spent a lot less time in the hospital in terms of months, but almost all of the time that I spent was in the acute ward. And so it was psychically far more stressful because the acute ward is where a lot of the really people who are extremely sick, who are going through, probably one of the worst moments of their lives, and who don't understand, many of them don't understand why they're there. And then there's all of these other really troubling things happening. And so it really was sort of like diving into, a pool of human suffering. And it was really difficult. There were times where I would get on the bus to go to the hospital and I'd want to get right back off, because it just really wore me down. So yeah, I mean, it certainly had a lasting impact. My husband still remembers that summer as you were sad that summer. That's usually how he remembers it.
I really want to thank you on behalf of the Kellogg Institute for coming and talking with us and sharing your really interesting work. Thank you everyone for coming. I hope you are able to take all this information with you and share it with others. And please join me in thanking Dr. Reyes-Foster.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really it was an honor, and I really enjoyed speaking with everyone.